Most folks think that grief only belongs at funerals, but what if you could throw a party in its honor, creating a space that actually helped you to heal? I'm so excited to share with y'all the grief party that I recently threw for myself. I want to share with you why I threw this party, how to know if a grief party is for you, the core components of the party, and tips for your grief party planning. We always begin with gratitude, so I want to thank you for being here. Peace. I am LA licensed therapist, holistic wellness coach and guide, and the creator of this channel, Reconnect with you. So let's start with why I wanted to throw a grief party. First, I want to share with you that this was a solo venture. This was a solo grief party that I threw, so other folks were not involved, which I really appreciated because that meant that I could make the space into what I felt I needed it to be. And full transparency, I have been sitting in and working through and exploring some really deep and intense grief. I'm going to say for a long time, since the pandemic, but especially within this last year, my grief processing has really intensified. And I wanted to be able to create a space where I could really sit with that grief in an intentional way rather than avoid it. And I don't feel that I generally avoid grief, but I think when life is lifing and you have other things on your plate that you are managing and balancing, it can be easy to not go as deep in your grief process than you may be able to otherwise if you dedicated a space specifically for that. I am also a big fan of shadow work. And actually, let me take that back. I don't know if I want to say I'm a fan of it. I do believe in its power. Shadow work is very powerful, but it's not always fun, and it is definitely not easy. But it has brought me some really profound change in my healing journey. So this was also a space centered around shadow work. And it was really about me shifting my relationship with grief. I joked in a post on social media and I was just like, grief is like the neighbor that lives down the street from you that you don't really like, but you wave at and speak to just to be cordial. That has summed up a lot of my relationship with grief, and I wanted to shift that. I wanted to focus on befriending grief and really recruiting grief as a companion for myself in my healing journey. And the last thing that I wanted to include in my grief party celebration, as far as my intentions go, is I wanted to call my energy back from all of the spaces, the places, the people where it's no longer aligned. So this was really a space about releasing stuck and stagnant energy. So that is why I wanted to have the grief party and some of my intentions in terms of how I went about creating the space. How will you know if a grief party is for you? I want to ask you just a few questions, offer you a few reflection questions. Are you holding on to any stuck or stagnant energy? If so, a grief party may be for you. That was one of the things that supported me in moving forward with the idea, is that I knew that this would be a space of release. The second reflection prompt that I want to ask you is, what is your relationship with grief like? Is grief something that you avoid? Do you feel overwhelmed by it? Does it make you uncomfortable? If so, a grief party may be a space for you. One thing that I'll share with you really transparently is that I am not afraid of grief. And I have, if you are familiar with astrology, I have a lot of Scorpio in my chart. And Scorpio is all about death and rebirth, deep transformation, mystery. So I've never been necessarily afraid of grief, but I do feel that grief it can be overwhelming, dealing with a lot of grief at the same time, trying to manage all different types of grief, and sitting with the complications of grief can be difficult. What I loved about my grief party, though, is that I was able to bring that together with my creativity. I am a creative at heart, and when it came time for me to put up my decorations and create my slideshow and some of the other components that I'm going to get to in a second, it really made this process be super fun, to the point where some points when I was preparing, I forgot that it was even about grief because I was having so much fun putting the space together. So if you feel like you avoid grief or you get overwhelmed by it, a grief party may be a good fit for you, especially if you want to start small. The last reflection question I want to offer you is, do you feel you can benefit from this really sacred and intentional space and container for you to process your emotions around grief? If so, a grief party might be right up your alley, and it may be supportive for you in processing those emotions as it relates to your grief process. I want to clarify that having a grief party is not a replacement for therapy or any other form of support. It is a form of self-healing, and it's a supportive ritual, but it is not a replacement for therapy. So I want to just name that a grief party alone is insufficient for you to process all of the grief that you may be navigating, but it is a really helpful tool that I want to share more with you about in the event that you decide to move forward with your own grief party. Next, let's move on to the core components of the grief party. So let's first talk about setting the space and really preparing the energy of the space, setting your intentions and things like that. I always start all of my rituals, and I'm saying ritual because I see my grief party as a ritual. And I start all my rituals with setting intentions. If you're not familiar with intention setting, an intention is, what do you envision to be possible in that container or in the time of your grief party? So setting intentions, you also want to make sure that you have the spiritual protection that you need. And I won't go into the specifics of that because I know that there are so many different ways that might look for you. For me, it was all about me calling in the protection and the support of my ancestors, who continue to watch over and guide me and who I have a connection with. It was also calling in the protection of my spiritual guides. For me, this was a spiritual practice. It does not have to be a spiritual practice for you, but it was for me. So calling in that spiritual protection was really important to me. And making sure that music was involved. I love music. If you have been here, if you're connected to me in any way on any other platform, I can assure you that music has come up. I am a self-proclaimed singer since childhood, a karaoke enthusiast, and I have an affinity for music. I love listening to music. I actually have I created a grief playlist, and these were songs that were centered around releasing, letting go, saying goodbye. So that was also a part of my setup and just preparation for my grief party. I also had disco lights. I was really excited about these disco lights. I've wanted disco lights for a long time. My inner child was like to the moon about the disco lights. I had so much fun with them. Those were optional though, but they added so much fun to my grief party. So that was kind of preparing the space for the grief party. The next part of the process was there was an opening and a closing, and I'm gonna kind of use these two as the bookend, so to speak, for the container. So the opening, I opened with a song that I created and sang, and I also played my singing bowls, and I gave some offerings to my ancestors, and that was kind of the main part of my opening. The closing was all about expressing gratitude. It was about reflecting on what took place, what happened, what came up for me, but also acknowledging that there was likely going to be more that came up after that. But I made sure to open and close the space with some really sacred rituals. I also did a lot of letting go rituals. So I don't know what this practice is called, but I had a white plate and I took some different color Sharpies and I wrote everything on that plate that I wanted to let go of and release. And after I finished that process, I broke the plate and I disposed of the plate. And it was really symbolic for me because I felt the release when I broke the plate. So that was one letting go ritual that I did. I also used fire. So I'm a fire sign and I've always loved fire. I believe in its energy to create and to destroy. Fire is one of my favorite elements. I have a lot of fire in my birth or my natal chart. So I actually burned some letters of forgiveness that I don't even know why I still had, but I wrote these letters over 14 years ago and I had just held on to them. And I decided to burn them as a part of my grief party because this was a part of me releasing stuck and stagnant energy. I didn't feel like I needed these letters anymore. There were a couple that I read and it was like I didn't even recognize what I had written. I didn't connect with it anymore. So using some rituals or making sure that you're including rituals that are symbolic of you letting go in some way. Side note, if you do decide to use fire in any way, or even if you use the plate ritual that I mentioned, please be safe. Please make sure that you have the equipment available and necessary for you to be able to carry these rituals out in a safe way to make sure that you can navigate your grief party as safely as possible. The last thing I want to mention, and this was one of my favorite parts of my grief party, was my rebirth. So there were two different aspects of grief for me and of my grief party. So there's death and then there's rebirth. And for me, the rebirth came after I had done the releasing and the reflecting and had done all of the rituals. And that's where my dance party and my disco lights came in. And I even changed my clothes. Like in the beginning of the death portion of my grief party, I was wearing black because that's typically the color of death. It's a color that most folks wear to funerals. And later during the rebirth portion, I wore white and bright colors. So there was even a symbolic color change to follow with the theme of the grief party. So my dance party, I had music, and I actually, instead of my grief playlist, I used my dancing playlist. I have a playlist, so many different types of playlists, but this was all about dance and movement and joy and just liberation. And I'm getting excited all over again as I think about what that space felt like. I was twirling around the room and singing and dancing. At one point I did break down crying. There was a song that came on, and I don't think it had anything to do with the song. I think it was just feeling all of the emotions from the entire experience. So having that ending where I could really further release, because dancing is, for me, is a ritual of releasing, and it's all about being in your body, connecting with your body. And so these are not, and I'm not even mentioning everything that was a part of my grief party because there was so much, but these were the main components that I wanted to make sure that I included. To give you some tips for planning your own grief party, you can start small. Your grief party does not have to look like mine. I will be very honest. This was an 8-hour portal. And looking back on things, I remember I was reflecting afterwards. I really could have split this into 2 different days. I could have done the death and the releasing and everything on one day, and then kind of the revival and the rebirth on a completely different day. So your grief party does not have to be extravagant. It does not have to be as involved as mine was. I think because I was having so much fun with it, and because my creativity was tethered to the process, I really took it and ran with it. And to be honest with you, I could have been doing this for more than 8 hours. But your grief party, it can be small. It can be something that you feel is manageable for you. It also does not have to be perfect. I remember at one point I was hanging up the streamers over my bar for the dance party. I wanted it to feel like I was at a bar. I had my non-alcoholic beverage and the disco lights were going and there was a music, and I actually have a bar here and I have my streamers hanging up. And I remember at one point I got tired because the streamers it was taking too long. And I don't even remember the last time I put streamers up, but it ended up being this long process. And I was like, you know what? I have 2 colors of streamers up here. That's it. I'm not adding any more. So it doesn't have to be perfect. It can be whatever you want it to be. And the decorations are not what's important. What's important is the energy you bring to the space and the intentions you set for it. Something else to consider, include only what resonates. I know that I've shared here and also in the full story about my grief party, which I'll link below. I shared a bunch of different components there and here, but you don't have to take all of these. If there's something that I've shared that really resonated with you that you want to make sure is included in your celebration, or that you may want to start testing with yourself, I encourage you to do that. But be sure to really think about what resonates with you and what you might need from your grief party, and that will help you to figure out what components you want to include. I end each and every video with a reflection prompt, and I want you to sit with this after this video, or even as you're watching right now. But what is one small way that you can celebrate grief? And if that feels too hard for you, what are you grateful to grief for? What has grief given you? If this inspired you, if anything here resonated with you, please let me know in the comments. I would also love to hear from y'all. If you were to have your own grief party, what would it look like? What would you want to make sure was a part of the experience for yourself? Or if you would ever host a grief party for your friends or for your community. So again, the full story about my grief party is in my latest article, which I'm going to include down below in the description of this video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more videos on being courageous in your healing and wellness journey, and moving intentionally and consciously as we all are continuing to navigate this world. Lastly, I want to remind you about my newly recorded sound meditation, which is called Clarity and Stillness. It is free and downloadable, also linked down below in the description. This meditation is perfect for holding space for grief. So I wanted to make sure that I shared that with y'all before I hopped off. Well, that is all that I have for y'all for today. I look forward to connecting with y'all again soon. But in the meantime, reconnect with you. Peace, y'all.